Welcome, everybody, to another podcast from Kotchian Test Prep. Today is SAT and ACT Mythbusters. So I'm going to talk with our tutor, Blake Jensen, about some myths about the SAT and the ACT in terms of the tests themselves and prep. Welcome back to another DSAT podcast where we talk about the new digital SAT. Today, we're going to talk about myth busting. So we're going to look at some SAT prep and ACT prep myths that are out there. And a lot of these are pretty common. So Blake Jensen and I, who is a long-term SAT tutor with our company, we're going to try to evaluate some of these, what we call myths, and point out maybe how they're either wrong or they may be true and they may not be true. So to get into that, let me introduce ourselves first. My name is Vince Kotchian, and I'm the founder of Kotchian Test Prep here in San Diego. With us today is Blake Jensen, who's one of our top SAT tutors. And I'm going to rely on his expertise because he's immersed in this stuff to kind of get to the bottom of some of these myths, and we'll talk about each one briefly. Obviously, there's going to be more to say about any given topic that we bring up today. But for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to kind of keep it short and sweet and give you the most helpful information we can in a short amount of time. All right. So welcome, Blake. Thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thanks, Vince.
Yeah. So the myths that just like any expert in any field, right? You're going to get some rumors out there about the tests in our case. And, we want to debunk some of these things. So the first one I want to bring up is that when you apply to college, some colleges, sometimes parents will say, or parents will hear, some colleges prefer the SAT to the ACT. Now, what do we think about this, Blake?
So it's not true. It hasn't been true for a while. It was true generally when the parents of high school kids were themselves going to college, and the coasts preferred the SAT and the Midwest preferred the ACT. However, that's not true at any colleges anymore.
Yeah, pretty simple, right? Like that's an easy one just to say no to. There isn't a preference for any given test at a college. ACT is just as good of an option as the SAT, even at the most competitive colleges in the country.
And colleges have a correspondence chart that basically converts SAT to ACT so that they can compare them on even footing.
Yeah, pretty simple. So we want to tell people, take the test you're better at. So speaking of that, sometimes people will tell us, or we'll hear people say something like, oh, well, students should be able to figure out whether they should take the SAT or the ACT based on their grades or based on the classes they've taken. Is there any truth to that?
So being ready for the SAT or the ACT, it does depend on what you've learned in school. But a high GPA isn't necessarily a guarantee that you're ready for the material on the SAT and ACT. Of the grammars. Let
me just stop you. What about the classes that you can predict which tests the students can be better at based on the classes that they've taken? What do you think about it?
There might be a slight preference one way or the other, but I found that it's variable enough that you don't want to just try and guess based off of some classes that a student took.
Yeah, because everybody likes shortcuts, right? Like I want to be able to look at a student's class schedule and their grades, and I would love to be able to tell them, hey, look, you are going to do better on the ACT or the SAT. But in fact, what should we do with those students to make sure they pick the right test?
Yeah, the best way to do it is to take a test of both and see how it goes, see how you score in each. They are fairly similar, but they're different enough to where even though we have some things that could help us predict on average which test would be better for a student, the stakes are high enough here to where you want to know with certainty which test the student's doing better in.
Yeah, so we want to make a data-based decision, not a guess, of course. But sorry to cut you off, Blake. I know you were going into another sort of prediction thing in the realm of myth, is that if we look at a student's GPA or if we look at their sort of academic class record, can we tell if they're ready for the SAT or the ACT if they have a high GPA?
I would say that the main factor in that is how much they remember from those high grades that they got in classes that were not this year. Teenagers are famous for knowing something for the day of the test and then forgetting it immediately a couple days later. So a high GPA doesn't really tell us exactly how much retention the student has from something even they took a semester ago, let alone several years. And so again, it comes down to taking a diagnostic test to see what kind of grammar rules they remember, how much stuff they remember from something like Algebra 1, if they're even in calculus or pre-calculus now.
Yeah, and it's just the way it has to be. We would love, again, to be able to, have that be true. If somebody has a 4.0, hey, they're going to probably do well on the test. But honestly, any tutor who's experienced will probably tell you they've met 4.0 students who really struggled with the test because of that lack of fundamentals. And, the student unfortunately just didn't remember a lot of the math from maybe previous years, or they had kind of coasted by and not really learned, not really had great reading comprehension because they didn't do very much reading outside of what they had to do. So we can bolster all these things, of course, in the course of SAT or ACT prep. But again, we should make a data-driven decision as opposed to try to predict. Great. So speaking of the test in terms of applying to college, we hear a lot about test optional these days. Schools will sometimes say, look, the test isn't required. And this came to be around the time when COVID hit, in 2020. But it's still going on. And what do we do if a school says they're test optional? A lot of times the myth, I think, is that they don't care about the test. But what's a better take on that, do you think, Blake?
Well, the first thing I would point out is that some people get confused between test blind and test optional. So test blind, for acceptance into a college, the colleges won't look at standardized test scores, SAT or ACT at all. They still can be used for placement in freshman classes, and they can still be used for merit scholarships, but they're not used for acceptance. So that's test blind. Test optional means that you don't have to include a test score in your when you're applying to the school. So with test optional, different schools handle things differently. So it's hard to say exactly what the way that your test will be used in your application. However, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it does improve your acceptance rates to submit a competitive score. Colleges have been very ambiguous with how that works. They kind of say a couple different things that maybe seem a little contradictory, but there is strong evidence that that having a competitive test score improves your chances of acceptance.
Yeah, and I think colleges, they want to keep their options open. Colleges don't want to dissuade anybody from applying, and they want to retain maximum optionality when they have all those applications to create the exact type of class that they want. So if tests aren't required, they just have a little more leeway to do that and maintain their credibility in terms of like things like the U.S. News rankings. And I think
there's one more thing about that. I don't know about every single college in the U.S., but I do know some colleges kind of have different buckets for test optional and for students who don't submit a test and for students who do. And so that could be one of the reasons that the acceptance rate is different between the two, is that you're competing for potentially more spots if you are submitting your test.
Yeah. So I just think it's an interesting topic that we can discuss in detail. But the bottom line, I think, for me, a lot of times is unless the opportunity cost seems too high, not submitting a test score is a missed opportunity. Now, we can make some cases that there are better uses of that time in terms of test, compared to test prep. However, if approached early enough, I think test prep is a valuable lever. And again, if you don't have a score, you missed an opportunity to, show another aspect of your application that's competitive. Cool. So let's go back to the test itself for a little bit. When we think about SAT prep, a lot of us are coming from the experience of what we did as when we were in high school. a lot of a myth that I've seen for years is that the SAT is kind of, or the ACT is really kind of just really about how you take the test. So there's these tricks, there's these strategies. Isn't that what tutors do, Blake? Do we just kind of teach these tips and tricks, and people who understand those tips and tricks are the ones who can do well?
Yeah, I hear that a lot too. The tips and tricks. I guess we'll call it theory. There are some tips. You do want to get comfortable with the format of the test. You do want to be able to pace yourself properly for a timed test. So there is some strategic stuff that getting comfortable with the test will help you with, using process of elimination on an answer choice. But that's kind of about it. For the most part, the ACT and the SAT are pretty good fundamental tests of the knowledge that a high school graduate is expected to know. In a lot of states, the high school exit exam is the ACT. The SAT was created according to standards that the Department of Education put out for high school students, their standards for graduation. So the tests have been created not to trick you or to be amenable to tips. It doesn't mean there's no strategy involved, but they're generally honest assessments of the type of knowledge you're supposed to have for high school.
Yeah. And I think that's, one of those things that a lot of times it's frustrating for a tutor to kind of hear that myth because, if it were that easy, literally everybody could do well with those tips. And of course, we see day in and day out students who really struggle with the test because of those fundamental issues. And we like to make it more about education, just kind of educating people, start preparing for the test early. If you think that might be you, and make sure, that those students are not just doing their work maybe over the course of high school, but doing, extra reading or math enrichment classes. Like all those things will not only pay off in the future for that student in terms of their academic success, but they'll help for the SAT and the ACT as well.
Right.
So any kind of academic,
I teaching students how to find the slope of a line or subject verb agreement or how to find the main idea of a passage. Those aren't tips and tricks, right? Like that's fundamental stuff that they've got to have for high school.
Sure. Yeah. And speaking of that, there's another myth. The kind of the flip side of this myth sometimes is that we hear, and this is something that you'll hear sometimes from organizations that are sort of anti-test, or maybe sometimes even from the test companies themselves. They'll say things like, "Well, research shows that even if you do SAT prep, your scores don't really increase very much," or that you can't really study for a test like the SAT or the ACT. What do you think about that?
It's not true. We've seen it, a lot where a student who, commits to studying can go up quite a bit in both tests, the SAT and the ACT. You don't know the exact questions that you're going to see, but they're very predictable as far as the concepts that you're going to be tested on. And so if you prepare for those, your score can go up quite a bit. So that one's definitely a myth.
Yeah, that's an easy one as a tutor to kind of debunk, right? Like we've seen students improve a lot. Like otherwise, we probably wouldn't be here. That's kind of the cool thing about intelligent test prep. And speaking of that, like we all probably have the sense, hey, if you can afford, a really good tutor, you're probably going to have an advantage no matter what you're preparing for, right? But what about, is that true that you have to kind of spend a lot of money, like on SAT prep or ACT prep to be able to make those kind of improvements?
No, not at all. Fortunately, there's a lot of very good free or inexpensive test prep material for both the SAT and the ACT. And I think you have some resources for that, for finding that. I think maybe up on your website. There's a lot of good stuff that's free out there. And you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money to prepare for the test. Although tutors can be helpful as far as things like accountability and putting together a program and kind of the big picture overview of the test prep itself, there are so many good free and inexpensive resources for self-study that someone who's motivated to improve a lot absolutely can.
Yeah, and we see this all the time on places like Reddit. If you look on Reddit, like on our SAT forum, and for really a forum for any standardized test, you'll see people, from all over the world who are extremely motivated, and they just go after it really hard, and they end up crushing the test because they prepared for it so much, even if they don't have the best study plan. And the cool thing about that is we can fix study plans really easily. And, we can point people, in the right direction for, hey, here are the materials you should be using. Here are the resources you should use. Here are the practice tests you should use. So as long as people know what those things are and they have that motivation, they can really prepare very well. And we see incredible success stories for people who are just doing self-prep. So really the key ingredient is motivation, and the secondary ingredients are just use the right kind of study plan and materials. And those are, that goes a long, long way. And those things can be done for almost, very little cost or, free in some cases. Okay, so what about the myth of the bad test taker? Is this a thing? Sometimes people have the attitude that they're bad at taking tests because they've always struggled throughout the years when it came time to take a test, or maybe it's even been told to them that they're not a good test taker by, teachers or parents. Can a bad test taker do well on a test like the SAT?
Absolutely. But the first thing you need to do is figure out what things caused the original problem that led them to feel like they're bad test takers. The first thing you want to do is make sure it's not a learning difference, something diagnosed that can be taken care of that way. But once that's kind of addressed, usually this could be a couple of different things. One of them is that they don't know how to study. They go through their notes and look at them and kind of talk through them and say, okay, well, I looked through my notes. I feel like I get it. I'm ready to go. But you don't know that you're ready to take a test and answer questions unless you actually take a test and answer those questions. So you need to review stuff, be able to answer those questions, work through a problem without notes. That's being ready. The other thing sometimes is that their fundamentals are a little shakier than they thought. And another issue sometimes can be recognition, right? They may know how to do something, but when you give them a test that's comprehensive, full of a bunch of different things, they don't know how to recognize what they're supposed to do. And that also is often the reason why students don't do as well on their, let's say, math final as they do on a chapter test, because they need to be able to not just do things, but recognize the type of stuff they're being asked to do.
Yeah. So there are some ways we can mitigate this. And I think the cool thing about the SAT and the ACT is not only that they're predictable, but we have a ton of official practice material that we can use to get people ready so that they can really not just, take one test, but take several and really analyze their mistakes to, know what's coming at least and be much more comfortable with the format.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it there. Hopefully we kind of debunked a few of these myths, or at least gave you something to think about in terms of how the answers to these questions may be a little bit more complex than you first thought. So thanks again, Blake, for joining us today. And if you guys have any other questions that we didn't answer today, or you have a comment on something we said, please feel free to reach out to us at vincekotchian.com, or just comment on the video, send us an email. We would be very happy to talk with you further about any one of the topics we brought up today. All right. So thank you, and see you guys later.
All right.